If you are constantly chipping at your self-esteem, at your confidence, it's going to be really difficult for you to dip into that motivation when you really need it, which is what we work on in the pivot season. We help you create a new default setting so you don't have to force yourself every time life gets in the way to get motivated or get disciplined again. Hey, you're listening to the Pivot Season. I'm your host, Ambar, clarity and identity coach. And this is your hub for all things self-discovery, navigating change, and reinventing yourself into the person you're dreaming of. Let's get started. Y'all, I am so excited. If you listened to my last episode, it was a very heartfelt episode about how I had been waiting for something for 500 days. And on the 501st day, I finally received the thing that I had been waiting for. I finally have approval for my resident card here in Portugal. I get to stay for another 3 years, and I am just so excited to not have this hanging over my head another day. So now I'm waiting for the card, but I finally have the approval. And I just wanted to share that with anyone who's out there waiting for something that is beyond your control. You already know the cliche sayings of stay positive, stay hopeful, but I want to remind you of what I said in the last episode, which is above all else, take care of yourself and show yourself grace and compassion, because waiting can be really hard and it can really test you. But that is not the theme of today's episode. Today's episode is going to be all about motivation and discipline, but not in the way that you think so. Because after over 200 of you took my Reinvention Pattern Quiz, I saw that 44% of you said that you get stuck in the follow-through. So you start strong, but then you lose steam. 40% of you said that you lose motivation once the excitement fades, and 43% of you said that you wish you could stay committed when results don't come quickly. And when we are talking about things like reinvention and pivots, it is very likely that the result that you are waiting for will not come quickly, and you need to learn to endure and persevere and continue to show up when things are not coming through. So how do you do that? How do you become that person, right? Today, we're going to talk about why motivation fades, the brain hacks to keep your motivation up when the payoff is far away, and as always, I will be telling you some of my stories. Before we get started, I am officially reopening spots for the pivot season. This is my signature 90-day program for the woman who is ready to find out who she is now, what she really wants, and to step into her next big reinvention. This program is specifically for the woman who feels like she continues to get in her own way. She struggles to make the decision to actually show up every day, and she feels like the reason that keeps coming up are things like fear, limiting beliefs, or the lack of habits that she needs to actually see the change through. So if that resonates, if that's you, go ahead and click the link in my show notes and go ahead and grab one of the spots that I will be opening up at an introductory rate, and it will be the last time that I offer it at this rate. All right, so let's get into it. First of all, y'all, I want to make one thing very clear. Motivation and discipline are not reliable sources of energy, especially for big goals. I never want you to rely on motivation or discipline. Motivation is very good for sprinting, but it is not good for running a marathon. So it is very good for helping you start, and it is not very good for helping you stick it out day in, day out when you're not seeing results. It's going to fade, but you still have to do the thing. So let's talk about it. Why is it that motivation fades? Because I want you to understand this so that you're not shaming yourself when the motivation fades and you feel like you just don't want to get up and do the thing. Motivation is very tightly linked to dopamine levels. We talk about dopamine a lot on the internet, right? But dopamine is essentially the chemical in your brain that runs the reward center in your brain. So when you feel like you are doing good, your dopamine level increases. But obviously, here's the problem. When you have a very big goal, that payoff is going to be delayed. So once that initial novelty wears off, your dopamine level is going to drop. And when your dopamine level drops, so does your drive to keep going. That's not a character flaw, my friend. That is just how brain chemistry works. And I feel like it's very important for people to understand because people often come to me for intro calls or for things like the pivot season, and they're sitting there and they're feeling really ashamed about the fact that they have this very big dream. And for the most part, what I have found is people are very clear on what they want. They know the change that they want to make. They are afraid to go after it, or they are afraid to admit to themselves that that's what they want. But it is very rare for someone to straight up just not know what it is that they want. So for me, it's very important for you to understand that that moment of motivation, it's going to be fleeting. Which is why if you and I work together in the pivot season program, I never preach motivation or discipline. I preach identity default setting, right? We work on changing your default setting so that you don't have to rely on motivation or discipline to force yourself into making the change. It becomes something that you do automatically. Another issue, again, going back to those big goals, especially if you want to have a whole new life, right? Like sometimes I have people come to me and they're like, I want to fall in love and I want to move to a new city and I want a new career, right? Like, girl, you want a whole new life. And I love that for you. But when you want a goal that is that big, there's a lot of uncertainty in that much change. And this isn't to dissuade you. However, this is to be cognizant of the situation that you're looking at so that you don't set yourself up to fail. I'm all about setting ourselves up to succeed. When you are wanting to change that much of your life, you're introducing a lot of uncertainty. And when you introduce uncertainty, you introduce fear. So again, going back to that thing, it is very rare that someone comes to me and they don't know what it is that they want. But a lot of the times there is fear that is getting in the way. And they're wondering why they can't stay motivated, why they can't stay disciplined. They're like, I'm disciplined in other areas of my life, but it seems like I just can't get it together in this area. And this can start causing a lot of anxiety for people. And it is very common for people to fall into this camp of feeling like they lack motivation, or maybe this just isn't meant for them. Maybe that's why they just can't get it together, even though they might be someone who actually shows a lot of level of discipline in other areas of their life. So here's what I often see. Someone is in this place. They're like, I have discipline in these other areas. I know I want this thing. I need to just get it together. And they start trying to beat themselves into submission by pushing for discipline. So they just like push themselves to do the thing. They find the perfect plan. They get up and they do it, and they probably stick to it for a little while. And depending on how this goes, this might be a moment when shame really starts kicking in. They start telling themselves really mean things and kind of shaming themselves into discipline. If we don't have the motivation, we are going to do this by brute force discipline. But usually when they go this route, they will be able to keep it up for a little while, but talking to themselves in such a harsh way, they will eventually backslide, again, because their identity default is competing with who they want to become. And then because they've had to shame themselves into this place and then will end up backsliding, this ends up hurting their self-esteem and their confidence. So in the end, going this route, it just is a huge way to backfire entirely. And what you're going to do is you're going to end up backsliding into this place where you then either burn out, or you're just kind of in this place where you feel really bad about yourself and feel like you just can't get it together. And then you just kind of end up fizzling out. And then it's going to take some time for you to actually get back up and try again. So when people who took my survey, 40% of them say they lose the motivation once the excitement fades. They say they wish they could stay committed when results don't come quickly. This is often the pattern that they're finding themselves in. So let's talk about 2 fixes that I want you to try, because I would never leave you hanging. Like, this is not that kind of show. So these are 2 things that I want you to try. let's first talk about one of the main issues that you're facing here with motivation. One is that the reward is really, really far away. The payoff is far away. And so your dopamine level is dropping the more you don't get that reward. So one of the ways that we can hack this is by having a reward that comes much faster than that ultimate payoff. A very good example would be for me with my 120-pound weight loss journey, right? Y'all, that's going to take me like 3 years to achieve because I'm doing it naturally. And I'm going to hit all sorts of plateaus along the way. I already have. I messed around. I was trying to have it faster and then I messed around and hurt my knee. So I have not exercised in like 4 weeks now. Well, I haven't done cardio in like 4 weeks now. And I've just managed to maintain this whole time, right? If the reward continued to be that 120 pounds, I would feel so disheartened right now. But by this point, I have kind of reset my identity default. So I'm already sticking to what I have to do anyways at this point. Like I don't have to force myself to do anything because that's just become my new default setting, which is what we work on in the pivot season. We help you create a new default setting so you don't have to force yourself every time life gets in the way to get motivated or get disciplined again. But going back to that example, something that I did was create really, really short-term goals. So I had two ways to do this. I had shorter-term outcome goals and I had short-term input goals. So for something like 120 pounds, I would celebrate every 5 and 10 pounds because that's much easier for me to come by. I'm probably going to hit that every month. I'm probably going to lose 5 pounds. I could bet on that, right? The other thing that I like to do, because even a month is like a long payoff and I might not get that 5 pounds that month. So the other thing that I like to do was an input goal. If what I needed to do to get those 5 pounds in 1 month, for example, was to go to the gym 3 times this week or was to eat 80% of my meals at home this week, it's really easy for me to reach that goal. I would feel very good about myself when I would reach that goal. And so that would become my weekly goal. And that's something I can celebrate every single week. And I can continue to feel really good. And the more I hit it, the more my dopamine rises associating with this event, and the more I want to continue doing it. Over time, it's going to become much easier for me to feel excited about doing it until it basically just becomes who I fundamentally am, right? And that's when we see the point of I no longer need willpower, I no longer need motivation, and I no longer need discipline because this is just who I am. And that's where I want you to get to. You need to understand motivation is how you get started. It is not how you continue to create a big transformation in your life because that source of energy is not sustainable. It is not a long-term source of energy. It is for short-term sprints. It helps you get started. It does not help you carry the path. Every time you complete those small actions and acknowledge it, you're giving your brain that mini dopamine hit. You're training it to associate the work with the reward and not just the result. And that's very, very important because when we are doing these big transformations, right? For example, I had a client come to me who wanted to work on her money habits. But what was the problem? Not only was she not getting dopamine hits from her money habits, she actually felt a lot of shame around her money habits. But one of the things she needed to start doing was budgeting and paying off debt. So when you're able to look at those smaller activities that you need to do that maybe you feel shame or apprehension about doing, in her case, it was paying off debt and budgeting. In my case, it was going to the gym and eating more at home. When I can start associating a reward with those things, it can feel better. Now, don't reward yourself with something that is going to undo the work that you've been doing. So, for example, I would never reward myself with food for going to the gym. I would reward myself with a nice shirt or an item from Sephora or something like that. Losing 120 pounds, I pretty much end up having to buy new clothes every 30 to 50 pounds. So another reward could even be me putting money towards a new wardrobe, right? Or new set of clothes. In her case, for budgeting and her money goals, you don't want to do something that is going to undo your money goals. So something she could have is having a fun budget that she pitches into that she gets to use to do something fun for herself. Instead of just having a let me treat myself, because that might have been how she got into the debt in the first place, having a little bit of a fun budget that allows her to have flexibility and still enjoy her life while still managing her finances in a way that feels good and safe and fulfilling for her. Over time, those small wins are going to literally rewire your neural pathways and install a new default setting in you, because you're going to create safety, joy, and fulfillment around this work. Okay, so what's the other thing that I want you to try? This actually is a little bit less directly tied to motivation, and it is a lot more tied to your mental landscape. And what I want you to do is a negativity detox. One of the things that I find people doing is that they'll start leaning on things like affirmations and all of those things. What's the problem with affirmations? You can say an affirmation to yourself, right? Something like, thinking back to my weight loss journey, I could say something like, I am so fit. That could be an affirmation. It's aspirational. In the case of my client, maybe she could say like, I am so wealthy, right? And this is kind of the trend with how people use affirmations. But what is the problem? When you say something to yourself that you don't believe, and then you spend the rest of your day acting as if that affirmation is not true, it does not matter what you said to yourself in the mirror for 5 seconds. Your brain isn't going to believe it. And so those affirmations are going to fall flat. So what I actually want you to do is a negativity detox, because what is very likely when you are falling into these moments of lack of motivation, you're feeling like you're lacking discipline, or you're not showing up and doing the things that you say you want to do in order to make those big changes in your life, is that you probably start being really hard on yourself. What I have found a lot of the times with clients in the pivot season or in embodiment sessions is that there's a lot of shame and a lot of fear that comes up. They start saying to themselves, maybe this is just not going to work out for me. Maybe this just isn't meant for me. 40% of you said in the quiz that your inner voice starts to attack you when things get hard. And it starts sounding a lot like, why do I always do this? This is why I can't have nice things. And so because 40% of you are feeling that way, it's really important that you address that negativity in your mind. Because when you get into that headspace and you are attacking yourself from within, it gets really hard to push. You understand, you're putting yourself in a position where the only way you can get out is through that brute force. That pushing yourself and forcing yourself into that submission and the discipline and the we need to get motivated kind of mentality. So what I want you to do is forget the affirmations for a second, okay? Stay with me. I promise you, stay with me, okay? For the next 24 hours, start by catching all of the negative things that you're saying in your mind, and I need you to redirect them for 24 hours, okay? So if you start saying things like, why do I always do this? This is why I can't have nice things. The reframe, it doesn't have to turn into toxic positivity. The reframe could be like, why do I always do this? What is it that I need from myself? How can I take care of myself in this moment? That would change the way that I show up. Another thing could be looking back on my journey. There was a point where I wasn't showing up to the gym as often as I wanted to. And I felt really bad about myself, to be quite honest. Because I was like, I'm going to go to the gym 4 times a week, la, la, la. And I did not do that. So I was shaming myself. But when I started changing it to like, well, okay, that's clearly not working, right? So instead of me shaming myself, what movement would feel good for me? And that just became my mindset. Like, okay, I'm not going to say anything mean to myself for the next 24 hours. What is it that I need? How could I take care of myself so that I show up in the way that I want to show up? After 24 hours, if you can maintain it for 24 hours, start maintaining it for 48 hours. Once you can do 48 hours, give me 72. I actually did this with my clients inside of the pivot season last year. And one of them told me that it started to feel like she had her own best friend in her mind, which is such a beautiful thing because she had been carrying around so much shame and she would shrink herself in moments of conflict with friends or even in relationships. And because she stopped attacking herself from within and started taking care of herself more, she found herself showing up better in relationships to the point that even her friends were pointing it out to her. Again, this is really important because when we start attacking ourselves from the inside, it can chip at our self-esteem, it can chip at our confidence, and it can chip at that motivation. And again, that motivation isn't what we want for the long term because it's not sustainable for the length of time that you probably need to make these big changes. However, we need it to get started and we're going to need it to get us through certain plateaus. If you are constantly chipping at your self-esteem, at your confidence, it's going to be really difficult for you to dip into that motivation when you really need it. My goal for you is not for you to constantly have to rely on something that is fleeting by nature, but it is for you to ultimately change your default setting and install a new default setting. When we work together, we're able to start helping you install a new default setting so that the things you need to do to make the change is just who you are. You wake up and that is who you show up as automatically. That is the best way to do it because it's not realistic for you to spend months or years forcing yourself into submission over a fleeting emotion like motivation. I remember reading the book Atomic Habits, where he says the people who have the best willpower design an environment where they don't have to use it. The people who have the best willpower design an environment where they do not have to use it. So that's ultimately how we want to go about designing your life so that it automatically builds the future that you want to live. So if that interests you, again, spots for the pivot season are now opening up. I will be opening that up this week as soon as this episode drops. And you can start signing up to that. It is a 90-day program for women who are ready to find out who they are now, what they really want, and to step into their next reinvention. And this is really a 90 days where we are going to zoom in on the things that are blocking you from moving forward in an area of your life where you really want to see change. Some of the changes I've worked with women on in the last pivot season cohort were things like limiting beliefs around money, career changes, as well as moves abroad, and even addressing health. If you feel like there's a really big change that you want to make, but you keep getting in your own way, this is exactly the program for you. Go ahead and check out the link in my show notes so that you can apply and grab one of those spots. So today we talked about motivation, why it's so fleeting, and why, girl, you need to stop depending on it. But we also talked about another way that you can hack your motivation so that you're always getting a fresh new source of it. And we also talked about doing a negativity detox so that you aren't attacking your confidence, your self-esteem, and your motivation from within. I hope today's episode was helpful for you. And honestly, I'm so excited to keep diving into these quiz results and seeing what other episodes might arise that might be helpful for you all. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I can't wait to chat with you next time. I'm with you in your pivot always. Bye.